Today we're continuing our discussion of normative ethics. So we're asking this question of how should we live our lives? We looked last time at utilitarianism. Utilitarians thought you should act in such a way as to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. In other words, live your life in such a way that you're not selfishly pursuing your own good, but you're trying to promote the good of everyone else. You're trying to maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain for everyone in your society or even in the world. What this meant was utilitarians are really focused on consequences. They're saying that the right actions are defined in terms of bringing about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. That's a consequence. Deontological ethics, which is the focus of today, is going to be more focused on rules and obligations. So it's not so much about bringing about the right results, it's about looking at actions in particular and seeing which actions are good actions and which ones are bad. So it might turn out that lying is a bad action. It's always bad, regardless of the consequences. It might turn out that killing is always bad, regardless of the consequences, and so on. Then in the next video, we're going to be talking about virtue ethics, which it doesn't focus on consequences. It doesn't focus on actions. It focuses on people. And it says, if you want to understand how you should live your life, think about the type of person that you should be. Which character traits should you work to embody or work to exemplify in your life? Now, personally, I think of deontological ethics as being a little bit more complicated or hard to understand at the beginning than utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is pretty straightforward. It just says the right actions are those that promote the right consequences. Deontological ethics, especially as presented by Immanuel Kant, who's the main person we're talking about today, it's going to be a lot more complicated. There's more technical terms, more moving parts. So I'm going to be describing the view at kind of an abstract level and then bringing in examples later to help illustrate what's even going on in deontological ethics. Now, one huge difference off the bat between utilitarianism and deontological ethics, utilitarians think that morality is defined in terms of bringing about the right consequences, whereas Kant, at least, thought that the consequences really don't matter. In order to be a morally good person, you should be willing to live according to the right moral rules. And that means regardless of whether or not you're capable of bringing about anything good, no matter what the consequences of your actions are, if you're living according to the right rules, that makes you a morally good person. But that being said, just to understand deontological ethics more generally, in deontological, deon is Greek for obligation or duty. So deontological just means the study of duty or the study of obligation. And again, obligations hold regardless of whatever consequences are in play. You might have an obligation to tell the truth, even if doing so is going to lead to some sort of disaster. But obligations hold kind of independently of whatever the consequences may be. Second, a key term for Kant is the word maxim. So a maxim is just a rule for action. It's something that, on the surface at least, it could be a good thing or a bad thing, but a maxim is just some rule that you might live by. So, for example, here are just a few maxims that you might live by. Don't tell lies, eat broccoli once a week, steal your neighbor's Wi-Fi whenever you can, sleep 8 hours each night, and so on. These are just rules that you could adopt, rules that you could live by, ways that you could structure your life. So a maxim is just a rule for action. We're not saying whether it's good or bad yet, it's just a general rule for action. Now in the list I just provided, some of these might seem morally relevant and some really don't. So eating broccoli, that doesn't seem like a moral issue, but stealing your neighbor's Wi-Fi, that seems like something relevant to morality. So when it comes to different maxims, we've got to try to sort out which are the good ones and which are the bad ones. Which are the ones I should adopt or live by if I want to be a morally good person. And this matters because for Kant, living according to the right maxims is what morality is all about. Whether you want to live this way or not, morality is telling you you ought to live according to this particular set of maxims, whether it makes you happy or not. It doesn't matter. Your own happiness, your own well-being, none of that matters. What matters is living according to the right rules. So again, we've got this question of which maxims are the right ones, which ones are the wrong ones. And fortunately, Kant gives us a test which tells us which maxims we have to follow and which ones we don't. So here's how Kant's test is supposed to work. You begin by taking a maxim. So do not tell lies. Let's just start with don't tell lies. Kant then asks us, can we will that this maxim becomes a universal law? And by universal law, Kant is saying, pretend that you have the power that you could just will it into being, that every single person in the entire universe acts according to this maxim. So if the maxim is do not tell lies, then by the power of your will, you make it so that every single person in the universe never tells lies. So I'm imagining what the world would be like if no other people ever told lies whatsoever. And then I have to see, does this lead to some sort of contradiction in what I will, or does it not? If a contradiction arises, then the maxim is a bad one. So I have to throw it out and do the opposite. If there is no contradiction, then that maxim is something that morality demands I do. So again, let's just use an example to illustrate how this contradiction stuff is supposed to work. So I'm talking primarily to college students. College students have lots of debt, right? So you take out a lot of loans so that you can go to college. What if when doing that, you operated according to the following maxim? I will take out loans and refuse to pay them back. So you're thinking to yourself, look, I don't want to pay these loans back. I'm going to live my life according to the following rule. I will take out loans and refuse to pay them back. Now imagine you want to find out, is this a morally good thing to do or not? And common sense might tell you, no, it's not a morally good thing to do. But you want to know for sure. You want some sort of test that'll tell you whether or not this is a morally good or bad thing to do. So Kant has given you this test. He says, okay, imagine that every single person in the entire universe operates according to the same rule. So by the power of my will, I make it the case that every single person in the universe takes out loans but refuses to pay them back. And then I think, what would that world be like? Well, for one thing, it would probably lead to all sorts of economic collapse, but more importantly, probably nobody in that world would give out loans. Why would anyone give out a loan if nobody ever paid them back? You're not just going to hand out money. So in a world where everyone who takes out a loan refuses to pay it back, there are no loans. People just don't give out money in that world. So by thinking about the original maxim, I will take out loans and refuse to pay them back, by making that maxim a universal law, it becomes impossible to take out a loan. What this means then is if in the real world you want to take out a loan, which we're assuming is true, you have to will that some people pay back their loans. In other words, you have to will whatever is required to make it possible for you to get a loan. So only in a society where people pay back their loans will you have a chance of taking out a loan for yourself. So since you want to take out a loan, you have to also will that some people are honest, some people pay back their loans when they take them out. What this means then is that when you perform Kant's test, you're willing two things. One is that you're willing the maxim in question becomes a universal law. So the maxim was, I will take out a loan and refuse to pay it back. You're willing that that becomes a universal law. The second thing that you're willing, since you want to take out a loan, is that sometimes people pay back their loans. So there's two things that you're willing. You're willing that some people pay back their loans, and you're willing that nobody ever pays back their loans. But that's a contradiction. You can't will both of those things at the same time. You can't will that nobody ever pays their loans back and that some people do pay their loans back. So those two sorts of things, you can't possibly will them at the same time. That means this particular maxim is a bad one. So we go back to our maxim, I will take out loans and refuse to pay them back. That led to a contradiction because you're having to will that nobody ever pays back their loans, and you're having to will that some people pay back their loans, because that's what makes it possible for you to get a loan in the first place. So there's a contradiction in your will if you adopt this maxim. since this maxim led to a contradiction, that means I have to do the opposite. Morality demands that I do the opposite. That just means when I take out loans, I have to pay them back. So the morally right thing to do when you take out a loan is to pay it back. Now, like I said at the beginning, this gets complicated. It might be hard to understand. There are going to be easier ways of talking about it, which we'll talk about in a moment. But this test is supposed to work for any maxim whatsoever. So any maxim whatsoever, you can run the same test on it, and either a contradiction arises or it doesn't. When a contradiction arises, morality says you should do the opposite. When there is no contradiction, then it's a morally good thing to do. So we can talk about the maxim, do not tell lies. It's perfectly possible for everyone to tell the truth all the time. The fact that everyone tells the truth all the time doesn't prevent me from acting on this particular maxim, do not tell lies. So since there's no contradiction there, do not tell lies is a good maxim. It's one of the rules for action I should be living by. So the maxim, I will take out a loan and not pay it back, that led to a contradiction, which means morality says I should always pay back my loans. The maxim, do not tell lies, that did not lead to a contradiction. That means it's a morally good principle to live by. So I should never tell lies, and I should pay back the loans that I take out. So since we're asking the question, how should I live my life? Kant's test has already given us two sorts of answers to this question. We've already learned that we shouldn't tell lies, and we should pay back loans when we take them out. So Kant's test helps us to understand how we should live our lives. Now I recognize this is moving fast, this is complicated. It's the concept of a contradiction is really abstract, right? And not only that, but we're having to imagine what the world would be like if everyone acted in the same sort of way. Fortunately, Kant has given us some shortcuts. So I'm going to set his test aside for just a minute and focus on what he thinks is central to morality. It's what he calls a categorical imperative. So a categorical imperative, it's categorical because it has no exceptions whatsoever. Imperative is a command. So this, as a categorical imperative, it's a command of morality that doesn't have any sort of exceptions. In other words, every single person in the universe should live according to the categorical imperative. It commands us to act in a certain way without any exceptions. And the categorical imperative comes in several versions. So Kant gives a couple different versions of this imperative, but he thinks they amount to the same thing. So even though they sound different, he thinks that they're going to generate the same list of rules. So they amount to the same thing. The first version of the categorical imperative is act as though the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. So this is really close to Kant's test. We've already kind of talked about it. We have to go through this imaginary process of what would the world be like if everyone acted in this exact same way? Does that lead to a contradiction? And if it does, then we know morality is telling me to do the opposite. The second version of the categorical imperative reads like this. Act in such a way as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of anyone else, always as an end and never merely as a means. So for Kant, people have a kind of inherent dignity, given that they're rational beings. And so the second version of the categorical imperative is basically just telling you, never treat a person like a mere object. You shouldn't just use people like objects, because that's beneath their dignity as rational beings. So you should always treat every person as an end in and of themselves. You should treat them with respect and with the dignity that they deserve. Whenever we're trying to figure out whether a particular action is the right one or not, we can test it up against either of these versions of the categorical imperative. We can say, does the action I'm considering performing involve treating someone like an object? So think about the case where you're taking out a loan and not paying it back. There, you're clearly just using someone for their money, right? You're taking their money for your own good, but you're just treating them like an object, treating them like a resource. And so that's beneath their dignity. That conflicts with the second version of the categorical imperative. The second version is telling you you can't treat people like objects. You can't treat them like a mere resource for your own good. You have to respect them. Or we could go back to the example I talked about in the last video, where a surgeon is considering whether or not to kill a healthy patient, take their organs, and save 5 others. If you were to do that, if you kill a healthy person, take their organs, and save 5 lives, you're using that person as an object. You're treating them as less than a person. You're using them as a resource. So even though your intentions might be good and that you're trying to save 5 lives, you can't treat people that way. You can't treat them like an object. So the categorical imperative in this case is telling us it's morally wrong to take organs from a healthy person to save 5 others. And that squares, I think, with a lot of people's moral intuitions. Now, one point that we should raise here, since the categorical imperative is categorical, it doesn't have any exceptions at all. That means it doesn't matter what's at stake. If you were faced with a situation where you had to kill an innocent person as a means of saving 1 trillion lives, Kant would say that's still wrong. It doesn't matter how many lives are at stake. You cannot treat a person like an object. You can't treat them as a mere means to an end. You have to treat them with the dignity that they deserve because they're a rational being. And so it doesn't matter what's at stake. You can't treat people like objects. So anytime you're considering whether a particular action is right or wrong, you've got that test, which is a little bit complicated. The idea of, can I universalize this? Will it lead to a contradiction? But then you've got an even more accessible way of thinking about it, which is, does my action require treating somebody like an object? Does it involve treating them as less than a person? And if the answer is yes, then don't do it. Morality says you shouldn't do it. And if the answer is no, if you're treating them with the respect they deserve, then fine, go for it. Now, to be fair, Kant's moral theory has gotten all sorts of objections to it over the years. For example, we said the maxim, do not tell lies, that seems to pass his test. That means, from a moral perspective, you should never tell lies. And again, since it's a categorical imperative, there are no exceptions. You should never tell a lie under any circumstances. A famous objection goes like this. Imagine that your best friend is hiding in your house, they're being hunted by a mass murderer, and the mass murderer comes to your door and says, "Is your friend hiding here?" Now, Kant would say, it's morally wrong to lie here. You have to tell the truth. So the mass murderer asks you, is your friend hiding here? The morally right thing to do is to say, yes, they are. And even if the mass murderer then breaks in and kills your friend, it doesn't matter. You still have to do what's morally right. So the morally right thing to do is tell the truth, and telling the truth means your friend is going to die, but so be it. That's the right thing to do. Because again, a categorical imperative doesn't have exceptions built into it. There are no exceptions. If do not tell lies is implied by the categorical imperative, it doesn't matter what's at stake. You can't tell a lie. Now, a lot of people will try to get around this type of problem. They'll say, you don't have to answer, right? You could just not answer the door. You could just say something that's true but misleading. And so there are ways that Kant might be able to work his way out of this. But whatever the case, even in this type of situation, you cannot tell a lie. The concern then is that the categorical imperative is just too rigid. It's an exceptionless command. It's a command that doesn't have any exceptions, but we need exceptions because moral life is really messy sometimes. One last concern for Kant is also this. For Kant, it's not enough that you live according to the categorical imperative. So you don't just do what morality commands you to do all the time. You also have to do it because it's the right thing to do. So your motivation for not telling lies has to be, it's the right thing to do. It's right for me to never tell lies. That has to be your motivation. If you're doing the right thing because it brings you pleasure, or say you give to somebody who's in need because you love them, that counts against the value of your action. You can't be doing it because it brings you pleasure. You can't be doing it because you love people. You have to be doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Any other motivations count against the moral value of your action. Kant gives this example of a storekeeper where a child comes into the store, let's say buys a $1 candy bar with a $20 bill, and the storekeeper gives $19 back, the correct change. So this is the right thing to do. This is an honest thing to do. And then we ask the storekeeper, why'd you do that? And they just say, well, I was afraid that if I didn't give correct change, the kid's parents are going to find out, and then people are going to be outraged, and I'm going to go out of business, right? Because people are going to be furious at me for ripping off a kid. And we say, well, okay, you did the right thing. You gave the correct change. You did what was honest, but your motivation was a lousy one. You shouldn't do the right thing because you're afraid of losing your business. You should do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. So if the storekeeper acted from this selfish sort of motive, then the action of doing what's honest loses its value. But again, suppose the morally right thing to do is to give money to people who are in need, and you do that because you love your fellow human being. If you're acting out of love for your fellow human being or because you enjoy doing the right thing, that counts against the value of your action. You have to be doing what's right because it's right. That has to be your motivation. And if your motivation is anything else, your action lacks moral value. So this may seem odd. It may seem like people are getting penalized for things like caring about their fellow human being. And so this is actually a way in which virtue ethics and Kantian ethics are kind of going to come apart, where the virtue ethicist doesn't have a problem with different types of motivation or even feeling good about doing the right thing. The virtue ethicist is fine with that, but Kant says that counts against the moral value of your action. So we'll get to that in the next video. For the time being, just to summarize, we looked at deontological ethics. This is a study of obligation or duty. So rather than focus on consequences like utilitarianism, we're focused more on actions, the right sorts of actions to perform, which rules we should live by, or which obligations we should fulfill. We looked especially at the moral theory presented by Immanuel Kant. He gives the most famous articulation of deontological ethics. There are other versions of deontological ethics, but Kant is the big one. And for Kant, the core of morality is this categorical imperative. It's an imperative that commands all of us, every single rational being in the universe, all the time, in all times, in all places, without exception. So it's telling you, you should live according to this imperative. You don't get a choice in the matter. It's not about what you want. It's not about the consequences. It's about obeying the categorical imperative. That's what morality is really about. We looked at a particular test that Kant gave us where we can plug in a maxim, which is just a rule for action. We can plug it into the test, see if a contradiction results. And if a contradiction results, then it's a bad maxim. If there's no contradiction, it's an okay one. But an easier way of thinking about all this is to think about the second version of the categorical imperative, which says, in effect, don't treat people like objects. You should always treat them with the respect they deserve. And so when you're trying to figure out whether your action is morally right or not, you should ask yourself, does it involve treating someone like an object? Am I respecting their humanity or not? And if you're not respecting the humanity of everyone else, then you shouldn't perform that action. We also saw some problems for Kant's account. It seems that since the categorical imperative is exceptionalist, right? It applies to everyone all the time, and it implies things like don't tell lies. The idea that you should never tell a lie under any circumstances, no matter what the stakes are, that seems a little too rigid. So we might think that morality needs to be a little more flexible than what Kant is offering. Kant also held the view that in order for your actions to have moral worth, you have to do the right action because it's right. If you're doing it because doing the right thing brings you pleasure, or you're doing it out of love for your fellow human being, those sorts of motivations count against the value of your actions. So you have to be doing the right thing because it's right. That has to be your reason. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, Kantian moral theory is really complicated. It has a lot of technical terms. It's pretty abstract. So the Kantian test especially is kind of abstract. It's sometimes hard to wrap your mind around. Hopefully the second version of the categorical imperative is a little more concrete and easier to understand. But whatever the case, if there are questions, if you need clarification on any of this stuff, I'll be happy to handle that on the discussion board.